Welcome to the Leadership Communication Expo, the virtual event that is giving you access to industry leaders who are sharing their simple, actionable, step-by-step strategies so you can fully embrace the leader you are meant to be, develop engaging and inclusive teams, and master conflict resolution. My name is Tammy Dunnett, your host, and today with me I have Adina Tovell, the Chief Curiosity Officer of Courage to be Curious, which I love. I just got to say that right at the top. This is a boutique personal and professional development company that helps professionals get inwardly reflective so they can be outwardly effective in life, leadership, and love. She is the host of Courage to be Curious with Adina Tovell, a weekly podcast with more than 160 live episodes, and she is known for inspiring the reaction, wow, that's a really good question. And today, I'm sure we will have many inspired moments as we are talking about from anxiety to authenticity, the art of brilliant leadership in uncertain times. Welcome, Adina.
Oh, thank you, Tammy. It's great to be here. And I'm so excited for this conversation.
Me as well. I've noticed through all the interviews, if there's a theme of this entire event, it's curiosity. And so today is really kind of the apex of curiosity, is this is your jam.
This is totally my jam, is, helping people to get productively curious in their work and in their reflection. So I'm excited about how this is going to impact people's leadership.
And I love the qualifier, productively curious. This just piques my interest even more. So maybe share a little bit more about who you are and how you got to be so fascinated about this topic.
So absolutely. And so who am I? As you said, my company is Courage to be Curious. And where I get fascinated is helping people to understand all of the wisdom and all of the brilliance that they have inside of them that helps them to be the best of who they are. And we live in a culture that is so conditioned or has conditioned us to look outwardly for all the guidance as to who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to be. And in leadership, I think that that's even more so. And so I want to turn that around and guide people in going inward to really discover how they can be outward. And in terms of how I got into this, because I was very much following this, and I had been in executive roles and I had run organizations, and I think always trying to mentally juggle all these things of what is everybody expecting and what do they need and how am I supposed to serve, and trying to, I think, turn myself inside out a lot to try to be everything I was supposed to be. And when I actually started my coach training program, people started turning these questions on me, and it took me inward to places I'd never been before. But what ended up unfolding over time was a series of questions that helped me to not only know myself better, but to embrace myself better as a leader and as a human in all the respects, that for the first time I felt like, wow, I am showing up authentically powerful in ways I never have before.
Wow, that gives me goosebumps. Just thinking about that process and almost kind of walking through that with you, knowing, as so many people do, is we do try to get that external validation and try to strive to be what somebody else thinks we need to be. And this is where a lot of leaders go wrong, and why we have so many leaders struggling to really empower their employees and create this psychologically safe workplace.
Absolutely. And I think when you're trying to be everything to everyone, you can't create psychological safety, and because people don't know what to trust.
That's a big one. And so when you were going through your journey, if we can just stick here for a moment, and you were starting to notice that outwardly I'm trying to be things, but there sounds like there was a dissonance for you, like there was a disconnect as to who you were trying to be and what you wanted to be. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, I'll share something pretty fascinating with you. Is it all started, and there was this one little exercise in my coaching program that said, list 3 things that make you happy. It was like the tiniest little exercise, right? Except that it completely threw me for a loop, because a few reasons that I didn't know what made me happy. One is I was the child of an immigrant, and we didn't do happy. We just did responsibility and obligation. But the other is that I have a keen skill, which is to be able to adapt into situations and adapt to people's styles, except for that the downside of that is it means that I can adapt so well that I never really figured out what was true about me. And I started asking this question because I just said, this is time for me to be done with that level of insecurity. And I started posing this question to myself that said, if my goal, my intention were to be happy, What would I choose in this particular moment? I didn't make it a big question. I made it a very narrow question. What would I choose in this moment? And that's because the big questions can sometimes be so overwhelming that we don't know where to go with them.
Yeah.
But the specific, like narrowing the question, and what I discovered is that initially I wasn't quite sure how to answer it. But then as I practiced, almost like going to the gym, and I exercised the muscle and I asked it again and again, things started to emerge, and some of them were like delightful and some of them were unnerving and some of them were surprising, but it opened up this box. And that's when I discovered questions can have an incredible power to help us see and discover things that we didn't even know were residing inside.
Mhm. And were you experiencing anxiety through that process? Is this the connection from the anxiety to the brilliance, or is this kind of something that's evolved as you've kind of worked through this and recognized this in others?
Well, I think the anxiety is partly, and doubt is the state that we're in when we're constantly questioning things. You know, who am I really? Do I know how to do this? Do other people trust me to do this? Am I an imposter, right? The anxiety comes because we don't really know, and we walk around silently doubting ourselves all of the time, which can be painful, right? It can be excruciating to be in that silent doubting because you have to uphold a persona outwardly that says, I know exactly what I'm doing, particularly if you're in a leadership role. And so that's the nature of the anxiety. But the journey here from that anxiety to authenticity, because when we do know who we are and we feel clear about how to show up and enact who we are, then we're in a state of confidence, and it's a completely different experience.
So fascinating. So this, let's come back to this exercise on happy for a moment. Was that kind of like the beginning of a new leader for you, like a new way of being? Was that the activity that really shifted you, or is that just kind of an example of how powerful questions can be?
That was actually the one that shifted me personally, or was the beginning of a journey. It actually, I would say I could calculate a new chapter of my life that actually began with that process of asking that question over and over and over again. Because even though it felt like it was about happiness, and we're in a leadership expo and it wasn't specifically a question about leadership, but because we're all integrated, we don't leave parts of ourselves like at the office or at home or whatever, that asking that one question started to really reveal the fact that there were lots of things that I either were keeping hidden about myself, or that I had just never explored out of fear about myself, or because I didn't know how to go about exploring them. But I think many of us walk around with the sensation that I was walking around with, which is I never feel totally at ease. I never feel totally confident. I never feel really sure that I'm who I'm supposed to be, where I'm supposed to be, doing what I'm supposed to be. But we live with that silence. And what this process did for me is it started to teach me, how do I find my way out of that hole?
Yes. And whether it's anxiety or just a disconnection or not happy, I think the word maybe isn't so important as is the recognition and the awareness that there is another path and a way to get out of the hole. So, because we're talking about anxiety to authenticity, the art of brilliant leadership in uncertain times, what does brilliant leadership mean to you?
So I love the word brilliance. And what I love about it, what brilliant leadership or brilliant being is that is uniquely us.
Mm,
I very much believe that each one of us was born with our unique blueprint, right? We have a unique fingerprint. We're all pretty familiar with that, right? But we actually have this unique blueprint that was just our special design that wasn't given to anybody else. But yet we've grown up in a culture and society that has tried to fit us into bell-shaped curves and into norms and into groups and things like that, that we lose track of what's in our unique blueprint in order to conform to something that we think matches what people are looking for or what's supposed to have happened. And so brilliant leadership is leadership that is so startling in its reflection of what's uniquely you, that people can see that light emanating, right? They can see the power of it, they can see the strength of it, and they can see the light that comes forth from it.
oh my God, that just paints such a beautiful picture. And I imagine the fact that so many of us have fallen prey, I'm going to use those terms, to the bell curves, to the norms, to those social expectations, that it's hard to even see that within ourselves. So it sounds like self-awareness or self-discovery might be a route here to start with.
Absolutely. So I'm going to, if I can, share my screen for a minute.
Yeah.
So we can look at some useful resources together. And so in this journey, right, from anxiety or doubt or that discomfort or dissonance that we were talking about to authenticity and the art of brilliant leadership. So this first state that we talked about is this one where I feel doubtful, like I'm not quite sure. I never feel quite sure. I never feel quite settled. And there's also oftentimes a sense of powerlessness that I have to do what either someone else or what I imagine the big universe of the company or the organization says I'm supposed to do. And then you just brought forth this word, which was beautiful. Like the second stage up is once we start to develop awareness and we understand our experience, we understand how maybe we've developed the patterns that we've developed or the practices or the ways of thinking. And we understand that there might be other options. It starts to open things. We can think of like this really narrow passageway and things start to open as we have awareness. Because then awareness takes us up to this next stage where we have agency. So once we have agency, that means I can start to do something differently. So if we take the journey you and I were just talking about with happiness, all right, I have no idea what makes me happy. I never am sure if I'm entirely myself. Then I start to ask this question. Somebody says, oh, well, there is this thing called happiness. Other people seem to have that experience of it. What happens if you ask this question? I start to become aware of things. And over that time, I developed this agency of like, oh, I can actually make choices about things that will feed that happiness or detract from it. Like, I have some control in here. And then this sense of agility, because when I have agility, I now can, like, you think about somebody who's agile and they can move and they can pivot pretty quickly. I can explore, I can experiment, I can see, what really works, what feels true to me, what doesn't feel true to me, what feels like I'm just matching what somebody else says, what feels like it's bringing forth the leadership impact I'm looking for, what feels like it's not. And so at this stage 4, it's like I can start to play. And then at level 5, we're at this place where very, very consistently, we feel a sense of confidence and clarity. We feel such a sense of authenticity and truth that everything just becomes so much easier.
I see this playing out. I mean, obviously with skills, I can see this pathway very clearly, right? Like the first time you learn to tie your shoes or, bake a cake, whatever that skill is, you can almost see that easier with skills than it is with our own self-confidence. So talk to us maybe about your process through this a little bit to give that soft skills approach to it.
Sure. So I call this the ABCs of brilliant leadership in uncertain times. And, I think just to talk here for a minute, that we are in uncertain times, right? We are in a time in which, if it was not already hard enough to be a leader before, it's so much harder now, right? Things have changed that we never saw coming. Things are moving at a fast pace. We know of like this mass migration, right, from work and people leaving jobs, which if you're in a leadership role, presents even more pressure, because if you have to manage teams and people are thinking of going and leaving, and that can fall on you in so many ways. And face it, we're all pretty fatigued. We've been doing this COVID thing for a long time. We've been doing remote or hybrid working for a long time. And so there's a lot of reasons why we can be feeling even more of that anxiety in these uncertain times that we're in. So what can we do about it? And so I want to just share like a little Venn diagram I've come up with, and what are my key ABCs. And so the first piece of this, to this being inwardly reflective so we can be outwardly effective, is I like to teach people how to be, as we were talking about before, productively curious again, right? We know that curiosity is something we're born with, and little children wonder all about things. But as adults, while it's very cool to wonder about black holes and all kinds of fascinating things, which I love to do, in terms of our own self and our relationship to others in our workplaces, there's this element of being productively curious. And I see this as one of our key components. I don't think anybody can argue right now that one of the key components of brilliant leadership in these times is our ability to adapt. And we've seen it over the course of these years, is that those who struggle more to adapt and to pivot have more of a rigid sense, have struggled more in some ways, because we're just being forced to, whether we want to or not. And so as a brilliant leader, we have to know how to be effectively and productively curious. We have to have the capability to adapt. And we have to be really, really good at boundaries, right? I think about curiosity as very expansive, adaptable is very flexible, but if you have expansion and flexibility without some boundaries to them, it doesn't always feel so safe to be in those places. And so in this model, some of the pieces that emerge here is that when we think about the intersection of curiosity and adaptability, part of brilliant leadership is, I'm missing an N, playful experimentation, right? Playful experimentation. How playful are we actually about our work? We tend to take ourselves very seriously, right? Everything we do has very high impact. We take things very seriously. Sometimes it's actually why I love to have typos or things like that in my presentation, because it's actually just, all right, it's playful, right? How serious is this, right? The fact that the N is missing, right? So playful experimentation. And what if we thought of brilliant leadership as actually including a sense that let's play at being our best selves. Let's play at getting this right instead of putting so much pressure on ourselves. And we talked about the fact that adaptability, which we know is key, but intersecting that with boundaries is both what creates safety and freedom. It took me actually a long time to understand this, because I tend to be a pretty exploratory and curious person, but to recognize that without structure, without boundaries, without clear lines, that it's not always so safe, right? That for us to be able to adapt and pivot, but know that there are some boundaries to things, helps people to have the freedom to be able to try things out, to experiment, to do that adaptation. And so it's really important. And then lastly, when you look at the intersection of curiosity and boundaries, and this is where I talk about the productive curiosity. When we're not just getting curious, and one of the places I love to think about this the most is like performance reviews, or when we're talking about somebody's, work quality and things like that. Am I just asking questions like, how are you doing? And how's it going? Questions that just sort of so wide open and have no real direction to them. But if you put boundaries with them and you put some structure to that curiosity, you can get really, really powerful into purposeful outcomes. And so this model of what is brilliant leadership, how do we actually achieve it? It's this intersection and this learning to use curiosity to be adaptable and to understand how to invoke boundaries effectively that really helps us to be brilliant leaders in uncertain times.
I think this is amazing. So first of all, when you start talking about curiosity, just the other day, we were driving out to the cabin, and I just want to share this quickly because I have never just been that playful person. I mean, I have, but I'm 52, right? So I got to sit in the back of the car and I had my phone down and I looked out the window and I'm like, oh, this is fun. And I was doing all the backseat child kind of things. How much longer? Why? What color? And just being really childlike to kind of explore my environment. And it was so much fun. But as then you went around to the boundaries, I'm like, there weren't any boundaries of that conversation. There weren't any boundaries as to what would be acceptable. And so it was starting to annoy my husband because I was being a bit childlike, but of playfulness to be something different and not to be so distracted with work, I can see where the boundaries would have probably allowed him to play too, if he kind of knew going, and experiment and explore. So just interesting how I'm connecting this back to something that didn't have boundaries and how it really didn't go well in terms of, wasn't fun for him, but it was fun for me.
Yeah, Tammy, and I want to talk about just even something that I know leaders face every single day, because how many people have had meeting dread or death by meeting, right? It's something that is so prevalent for people. And then you put people on Zoom and virtual, and it can become even worse. And that's because lots of times when we go into a meeting, either there are no clear boundaries and structures for how to conduct the meeting and what's going to happen, but also the curiosity sometimes could be either so wide open or not existent at all, right? So either, well, let's brainstorm about this, but there's no structure to that brainstorm. There's nothing that makes it at all productive. And so we end up, oh my gosh, we finished 2 hours and where have we gotten, right? Or we're in the meeting and somebody's trying to be creative and inspire some brainstorming or curiosity or strategic thinking, but people in the room are not adaptable because they're feeling really rigid and, stuck, because there isn't an element of safety, which often, as we've just said, comes from a lack of boundaries.
Mhm.
Where are we going? What are we doing with this? Who's going to be responsible for it? And so without those boundaries, people don't want to adapt and they don't want to be curious, but then we don't move forward.
Sure. And why are you acting this way came to mind with the boundaries too, right? Like, I don't understand why you're doing this because we haven't talked about the rules of the game kind of thing.
Exactly.
Oh, I really, really enjoy this. And the safety with freedom, what came up there is just, thinking about speed limits. We all know we were talking about going into a certain place, you can feel safe because you know what the limits are and people around you are not going 200 miles or kilometers an hour, but you're all kind of following the same boundaries to keep it safe for everybody. There's those rules that are inherent in everyday life that we could probably learn from in our relationships and building confidence or our leadership.
Absolutely. And just like a fun fact, I used to live in Brazil for a little while. And one of the things about Brazil, because I talk about lane lines on the roads a lot as a metaphor for boundaries, is that in Brazil, in the city I was in, they really didn't have any lane lines on the road whatsoever. And they didn't have a lot of traffic lights. Like there would be speed bump like things, and then there would be big places to turn around, but there were not a lot of traffic lights and there were no lane lines. And it felt incredibly unsafe. And you didn't feel free to enjoy your drive, right? Because you constantly had to be so vigilant. And in terms of adaptability, I I didn't want to move. Once I found a spot where I felt safe, I just wanted to stay there. I wasn't adaptable because there was no safety. And so if we think about these metaphors and we think about all the ways that they show up in our lives, people don't know what to expect. We haven't told them why we're doing what we're doing. We haven't set up the rules of the game or the parameters. We haven't told them why we're getting curious right now. All of these things, then we're not agile, we're not moving. And so to be a brilliant leader, to move from that state of anxiety to authenticity and to have confidence, to be able to lead with confidence, we need these ABCs.
So this is the pathway, it sounds like, to travel through the 5 stages from anxiety to authenticity, is to really look to see which one am I strong at, which one can I maybe grow a little bit in, and then how can I learn from them.
And how can I execute effectively, right? How can I execute effectively in each of these domains?
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that there are times when one is more dominant than the others, depending on what the situation is and what it calls for in terms of curiosity versus adaptability versus boundaries, as you'd mentioned. The brainstorming could be a boundaryless activity, but if we tap into the benefit of a boundary, we'll probably be more productive in the outcome.
Absolutely.
That is amazing. So how does this, and I don't know if confidence is what we want to focus on necessarily, but how would this play into someone feeling more confident if they were to walk through this journey? I mean, first they need to be confident enough to try it. So that might be the first barrier.
Well, I think because, first of all, I want to say, while these are big concepts that are on this diagram here, they're all skill-based. So part of what we do is actually teach the skills. What are the skills of productive curiosity? How do you learn to set boundaries? Because boundaries are important in every aspect of leadership. I mean, whether you are leading a meeting, whether you are project managing, it's people interfacing. And so boundaries are always important. But these things are skills-based. So they are things that you can learn, that you can strengthen, and that you can improve. And just like anything else, you talked about like cooking something for the first time and how unnerving that can be, and you might have unfamiliar ingredients. I remember the first time I made Indian food, right, and I wasn't as familiar with all the spices, and I'm so worried, what if I put in too much or too little, or I don't know how this is going to interact. So when we don't have that and we don't understand, we don't have any history with it, we feel very nervous. But it's the same thing if we don't know how to come forward with productive curiosity, how to be adaptable in the right ways, in the right moments, how to set these boundaries, then we can't operate with confidence, because virtually every moment in leadership is requiring some combination or all three of these. So it's actually teaching and learning the skills that go with each of them and having an opportunity to practice those things so that you become skillful. And just like with the cooking, the more practice we have, the more we've done it, the more we master certain skills, the more confident we feel.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like an application that you need to try out in maybe safe situations initially, where it's not as potentially threatening to your face, your ego, your idea of who you are as a leader, just to see and test the waters a little bit. Maybe is that what you would recommend to start out with?
Yeah, we have two ways of working. One of them is an existing program. One of them is a program that's coming up. But the existing program, which I happen to believe is the most effective structure for professional development that exists, or leadership development that exists, is something called community of practice. Because when everything you're doing has tremendous implications, or you're being evaluated or judged on it, or it's going to, impact, people are very nervous about getting too curious, about taking chances or risks, and there's not a big investment in the learning. But community of practice is a model where people come together in order to talk about the practice of what they're doing, and they bring examples from real life in order to fuel the learning. So if this were a group of leaders involved in a community of practice, they're talking about perhaps how we do performance reviews together. Each person is bringing their experience, and then we're talking about how these things intersect and play out, and how they're utilizing the different skills. And there's an opportunity to up level and teach skills and practice in a really safe environment that can then be taken out onto the floor, so to speak. And so I like community of practice, which is typically lasts from 6 to 12 months with a group of leaders, that is very much fueled by what they're doing out in the field, coming in to be able to deepen the practice and learning, and then go back out with strength and skills. By far, in all of my experience, I have found that to be the strongest professional growth and development model I've seen. We also are launching a program in 2022. So I encourage people, if this feels inspiring to you, to stay with us, called Wisdom Warriors. And these are 30-minute experiences that are placed throughout the week that really focus on this curiosity piece and that self-reflective piece, where we very much bring questions and help people go through that internal reflection that leads them to becoming more outwardly effective in these 30-minute experiences. And so it's something you can do from the quiet of your own desk or your home office or bedroom or wherever you happen to be logging on from, but it builds that self-inquiry and reflective practice that really strengthens that part of the model here.
I really enjoyed that. And I was thinking there's a lot of transferable skills. One, going back to the back of the car and being very childlike and playful, I actually can see the transferable skills from being giving yourself the freedom to kind of tap into that playfulness as you have there, that playful experimentation, transferring that into the professional world, and then really honing out these skills. So that's very much appreciated. Now, speaking of questions, I want to just share a little shameless plug here for you. You have some fabulous questions, and I'm not sure if this is part of what we're going to put in the links below, but you let me know. Talk about those cards, because I cannot wait to get my cards.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, we were talking about in the story we began with around, happiness. And I mentioned that asking myself the question, right? If my intention is to be happy, what would bring me happiness in this particular moment, is recognizing that questions, they cause us to pause, they cause us to pivot from whatever momentum we were on, and they cause us to kind of think differently. There's something in science, it's called instinctive elaboration, that if we're asked a really good question, we can't help ourselves but to be able to stop and to try to consider it. And it's a beautiful thing. And so I use that understanding of instinctive elaboration all the time. If I'm beating up on myself, if I'm feeling stuck in something, if I'm feeling badly about something, I was like, what's a good question? Because as soon as I find a good question, I will be able to pivot and turn my mind in a new direction. And so this card deck is 52 cards. all with these productively curious questions that were designed to activate that instinctive elaboration, along with a guidebook in terms of how to use them. And so in the lead deck, the questions are they're divided in half, and 26 of the questions are questions that I ask myself as a leader about me. And then 26 are questions that I ask to build my awareness about my team. And should I pull one out? Let me just see what happens.
Sure, let's do it.
All right, so if I pull one out here. Okay, so this question I just randomly selected. What triggers me into a reactive state? And how do I feel and act when I get triggered?
Okay, that's easy to answer.
Right? So, but it's so important for the self-awareness of a leader, because every single moment that the leader shows up, their energy transfers to someone else.
Mhm.
And if they haven't stopped and paused and realized I'm triggered right now, it's going to bleed into their interactions with others. And if they're not aware of where then they default their behaviors to,
Yes.
that's going to impact the morale of the team. So again, like starting to build that awareness. We all know we get reactive, but do we really pay attention to how it shows up and how it impacts? So the deck is filled with questions that are really designed to support that practice of inward reflection.
Yes, that's so brilliant. Now you have 5 game-changing questions that you want to share with the audience today. And with your permission, we can put a link for those cards in your speaker page as well, if you'd like. But let's talk about the 5 game-changing questions.
So 5 game-changing questions, and this is beautiful because you brought this up. It does tell the story we were talking about at the beginning of this. So my personal story of how becoming aware of questions could actually start to shift and change the paradigm of my thinking. But because questions are one of the most powerful tools we use and that I believe are out there, and they are totally free, right? Questions in a sense are free. We can find good ones in my decks. We can find good ones in places and things like that. But they're easy to grab hold of. That the 5 game-changing questions that are in this packet are a great place for people to get started. And whether you ask them in the context of your relationship, you ask them in the context of your leadership, or you ask them in the context of your life, it doesn't really matter which door you enter through, because if you are practicing a reflective person and a practicing a reflection person, then whichever door you enter through, it's going to spill over into the other domains of life. So 5 game-changing questions and how they can transform your life are 5 of my most favorite questions that can really start to open up the self-inquiry.
Love it. A few of my favorite things is playing in my head right now after you said that. I would sing it, but we shall not today.
Trust me, I sing it a lot.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your zone of genius and really taking a deep dive into what I love the definition of brilliance, and I love the pathway to get there, and just having you here has just been a great honor.
Well, absolutely. Thank you. And, your curiosity, I think, is what fuels these conversations to be as brilliant as they are, because it is such an innate thing for you, and you bring it forward to make these so meaningful. So thank you for all you're bringing forward to make this expo just a fabulous resource and opportunity for everybody who's participating.
I appreciate that. Give me a little tear in my eye. Oh, yeah. Thank you again so much. Now, for those who are watching, don't forget to grab the links below. The 5 game-changing questions and how they can transform your life will be available below, and all the links to stay in touch with Adina. Thank you so much for watching today.